Good afternoon, everyone. We acknowledge that the lands of which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect and diverse histories the cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 8th webinar workshop in a series of Let's Talk Future Ocean and Coastal Infrastructures webinar workshops. My name is Sheridan Thompson, and I am the Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator for FOCI. The webinar is part of the Future Ocean and Coastal Infrastructures Research Project, designing safe, sustainable, and inclusive industries and coastal initiatives through collaborative, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary research. Interdisciplinary, where FOCI research draws on the expertise from as many disciplines as possible, and transdisciplinary, where FOCI aims to treat non-academic knowledge as significant as academic knowledge. Thus, FOCI brings together academic, government, business, nonprofit, and Indigenous community partners focused on understanding key aspects of ocean and ecosystem change and developing strategic and effective solutions that can be applied both locally and globally. FOCI is one of a handful of Ocean Frontier Institute large research projects funded by the Canada First Research Excellence Fund. We would like to thank you all for being here, but we would also like to acknowledge that this webinar series would not be possible if it were not for the FOCI partners, most notably Canada First Research Excellence Fund, as well as the Department of Industry, Energy and Technology of Newfoundland and Labrador. Today, presenting, we have Dr. Mark Stoddart, a professor with the Department of Sociology at Memorial University of Newfoundland. Mark works closely with WP FOCI Work Package 6 leads, Howard Ramos with the Western University of London, Ontario, Karen Foster, who is with Dalhousie University of Halifax, Nova Scotia, as well as collaborator Tuomas Ylä-Antilla, who is with the University of Helsinki in Helsinki, Finland. Professor Stoddart works in WP6, extends over a decade as the co-lead of the Canadian team of COMPON, Comparing Climate Change Policy Networks. COMPON is an international comparative project on climate policy networks and media discourse involving research in 20 countries. He is co-author of the book Industrial Development and Ecotourism: Can Oil Extraction and Nature Conservation Coexist? And co-editor of the Handbook of Anti-Environmentalism and Revitalizing Place Through Social Enterprise with Memorial University Press. And I think that sums up my introduction to Mark. I'm going to let him take over from here.
All right. Thank you very much, Sheridan. I'll just share the screen here. And does that look good to everyone? Yeah, excellent. Okay, great. Yeah, well, thank you all for joining this afternoon, this evening in Finland, and wherever else anyone's logging in from. I'm basically going to provide a bit of an overview of WP6 in general, kind of briefly, and its connections to COMPON. Focus a little more in depth on some of the high-level takeaways from task 3 and 4 of WP6, which are the kind of media discourse analysis and policy network analysis, and then just try to wrap it up with some kind of a kind of general conclusion and some, hopefully, lots of time for discussion. All right, so I want to start with, before I talk about WP6, this figure from an IPCC report that I think does a really nice job of mapping out global climate social ecological processes. And what I'm going to talk mostly about today relates to these things that are kind of buried in the diagram. They're kind of in the smaller print there, under from urgent to timely action, the idea that we need kind of to be thinking about governance, we need to be thinking about knowledge and capacity, and under this human systems transitions part, you know, the kind of the societal parts of energy, industry, urban, rural infrastructure, kind of transitions that we need to kind of address. So these kind of red underlined things here, I'd like us to think a bit about as kind of the social, cultural, and political infrastructures of climate change responses, right? These kind of persistent networks and relationships around discourse and knowledge, and around governance and kind of policy network relationships. And I think we can think of those as these types of infrastructure in this kind of cultural, social, political sense. when we look at what we're doing with WP6 in general and tasks 3 and 4 that I'll talk about today in particular, and also what we do in Compon, really we're breaking down these kind of things that are a bit black boxed in the IPCC figure, right? Like they're kind of mentioned as singular words, but we're kind of looking at different dimensions of the kind of knowledge and capacity piece and the governance piece that need to be part of moving from urgent to timely action to human system transformations, as per that IPCC figure. Actually, I think, like I say, I think it does a nice job in general, but I think we can focus in, we can hone in on these dynamics around knowledge, capacity, and governance in a bit more of a detailed kind of way. These things that shape policy outputs and outcomes and help facilitate or also impede human system transformations. So the big takeaway from today, which I'll put right up at the front, is that a better understanding of climate discourse and policy networks as these kind of social, political, cultural infrastructures helps us really to clarify what are the challenges, what are the opportunities for sustainability transitions in specific cultural and political contexts, right? So I'm going to illustrate this now with the work that we've been doing in WP6 in particular, but that's really, I think, the kind of more theoretically important takeaway I hope people will take from today. WP6 has 4 interrelated tasks. A survey of the general public, which was largely led by Karen Foster, who I see has just joined the call, one of our team co-leads at Dalhousie. Task 2 was a Delphi process, which is kind of a repeated, kind of recursive, open-ended and then closed-ended survey with subject experts in a particular domain. So in this case, people who are climate researchers or climate experts about their views on climate policy orientations, who should be or is influential in climate policy networks, who needs to be more included, things like that. Task 2, mostly led by Howard Ramos at Western. And then tasks 3 and 4 were the 2 that I'll talk more about today that connect to Compon, which I'll unpack in a second. But task 3, looking more at media discourse. Now I see, of course, that it's misspelled, even though I've read over this slide deck many, many times over the last few days. Of course, you catch the typos in real time. But media discourse, in looking at the four of the Atlantic Canadian flagship news media outlets in particular. Task 4 was a policy network survey of policy network actors across Atlantic Canada, across all 4 provinces. And the roster of people we were looking at or respondents we were looking to were people that we identified as from the media discourse analysis and from the Delphi process, people that were kind of indicated as important in climate policy or were visible in kind of media coverage of climate policy debate, things like that. And let's say all kind of intersecting ways of looking at the social, cultural, and political infrastructures of climate action, climate responses, things like that. Now, to say just a little bit about Compon, because I think for the FOCI folks, this is likely to be very unfamiliar. This is a project that's been going since about 2007, involving case study teams in about 20 different countries since that time, and very happy and grateful that Tuomas was able to join today as one of the co-leads of kind of the international kind of Compon leadership, the current kind of leading council. And so he's a team member on this project as well, and long-term collaborator. And what Compon is largely doing, and I think this paragraph here being probably the most important one, is focusing on policy networks to shed light on what organizations exert influence on policymaking, what beliefs they carry, what kind of coalitions they form, et cetera, and so on and so on. And I'll just say, if folks want a bit more of an overview of Compon, rather than digging into it too much here, there's a really good piece that he led in energy research and social science a few years ago with some other collaborators on the Compon project, myself included, that gives a bit of an overview of the research design of the project, how it kind of rolled out through 20 countries, what some of the tensions and difficulties of that were, and how those were addressed. So if you want a bit of a longer read on what this massive project is, that's a good place to start, I would say. All right, so turning to actually some of the takeaways, the high-level takeaways from WP6, task 3 and 4. As I said, this involved the kind of media discourse analysis for task 3 and policy network analysis for task 4. Before I kind of get into that, I'll maybe just give a quick shout out to Yishi Yang, who has been a research assistant and very involved with both of these tasks, as well as Laura Funke, who's worked as a research assistant, MA student of mine as well, who's worked particularly on task 4. The two of them actually also taking the lead on some of the analysis and the paper that will come out of the policy network analysis stage, the task 4 kind of publication that we're working on right now, that this presentation kind of draws from. Starting with the media stuff, though, one thing we were looking at are key issues of consensus and contention, and the kinds of issues that are coming up a lot. So higher on the chart, the more often these themes are kind of coming up. And rather, because these codes are very opaque to probably most of you, this most visible one is just that climate change is a risk. It is something that we need to deal with. It is creating harms and risks, coming up often and coming up with high levels of agreement. Not a lot of disagreement on that. Second, climate change is occurring. Just kind of an acceptance of the scientific consensus that anthropogenic climate change is a thing, it is happening. Again, comes up a lot and with a lot of consensus, stuff in green being the more consensus kind of themes. But then you get the next couple of themes that are most prevalent are also ones that have more dissensus or contention. Carbon tax on CO2 gets more kind of debate, and this idea of that we should restrict oil exploration and extraction, that also gets more debate, right? That's also an area of contention. Beyond that, though, the next most prevalent themes are things like support for renewable energy transitions, largely a consensus theme, not a lot of critique or debate. And the theme that the provincial government has a large role to play in climate change responses, mitigation, adaptation, also a lot of consensus, not a lot of debate, right? And those probably are about the, half dozen more prevalent themes that we see in the media discourse, including the couple that are probably the most contentious in the Atlantic Canadian kind of media discourse network. And I'll just mention also, this is the paper, if you want a bit of a deeper dive into this, that's the paper that Yishi and I did in review of policy research on the media part of the analysis. It's part of also a special issue on local and subnational climate governance and climate governance kind of stuff that folks might find interesting. Turning from the kind of discursive themes to who are the policy actors that are most prevalent and featured in the media, we tend to see that provincial government and national government actors and political parties are amongst the most visible. They tend to dominate the media discourse network, right? There's relatively little visibility for municipalities or local policy network actors, which is quite interesting because if you look at the research literature on multi-level climate governance, there's been a lot of focus increasingly on cities, on cities as really important climate actors, as sites for adaptation and mitigation. We don't really see a lot of presence, though, for municipal actors in the media discourse. And I'm going to come back to that in a sec when we dig into the policy network data as well, because I think that's a kind of an ongoing thread that's kind of interesting here. Also, though, we see that this idea, though, that regional and local policy network actors have an important role to play, those ideas do come up, but they're what we might call diffuse and high consensus. So by diffuse, that means they don't necessarily come up that often, especially around local policy network actors. They don't come up that often, but they are articulated by a wide range of people across the different media outlets. So they're not just concentrated amongst one or two people or, one or two media outlets. They're kind of diffuse, but just not that prevalent. And they are high consensus. Nobody's really arguing against it for the most part. I think we find a few examples that are very rare where people say, well, the provincial governments or municipalities just don't have the power or capacity to deal with climate change. It has to be a national government issue. That would be the example of a very rare lack of consensus with those ideas. Shifting over quick to some of the high level kind of findings in the policy network analysis. Again, we'll start with kind of the discourses or policy orientations and some of the stuff that has the most consensus and maybe the least consensus. And again, the stuff in green has high consensus. And what you'll see at the top of the chart here, the top of the figure, is high level of agreement that climate change is currently occurring, almost unanimous, agree or strongly agree. Similar high level of agreement that human activities are the driver, but also things like that renewable transitions will ultimately be beneficial for the economy. These ideas that provincial governments and municipalities have an important role to play, those are extremely high consensus as well, and amongst across the policy network kind of actors, and that provincial governments and the national government should be taking kind of leading roles in reduction. I'm going to jump down to the bottom of the figure because these are also areas of very high consensus around disagreement. So these bottom three items are all measures that we would think of as climate skepticism or climate denial, right? Saying that climate change is more beneficial rather than harmful, climate science is still too uncertain to be a basis for public policy, and climate change is, those kind of ideas. And we see a lot of consensus in disagreement with those statements. So in other words, people rejecting those kind of skeptic or denialist viewpoints, right? Kind of not going into those. So that's kind of interesting. We do see in the policy networks here really not a lot of buying into kind of climate skepticism, a lot of kind of consensus that climate change is happening and things need to be done about it, right? And I will point out our respondents to this were across governments and political parties. So there are more kind of liberal and more conservative respondents here. So it's not, we did kind of look into it to make sure it wasn't just an artifact of our sample and who participated. And I think it is kind of interesting that it is a nice spectrum of respondents who replied along those lines. Where we see a bit less consensus, and not necessarily a lot of contention, but less consensus, are on a couple items that are more about justice, intergenerational justice, the voice of youth, and interregional justice. So the burdens that developed countries should bear, as the main responsibility vis-a-vis underdeveloped countries or less developed countries. So less consensus there, less consensus around balancing out, kind of renewable energies and energy security interests, or, how we manage energy supply, things like that. So some questions about the ability for renewables to scale up and really meet kind of energy security needs and really replace fossil fuels perhaps. So a little more dissensus there, or not the same strength of consensus we see with some of those other items, for example. Now, when we look at actors and the relations between actors, to kind of switch things to the structure of policy networks, one thing that we really see that's interesting is when we look at three different types of relationships, we see three fairly different structures to the policy network. So what the infrastructure of climate governance looks like, to a degree, depends on what kind of relationship we're looking at, right? So on the left here, my left, this is perceived influence on climate policy. How influential are actors there? And they've been anonymized just for participants' confidentiality, and everybody's kind of ranking the influence of a roster of about 100 different actors that we think are important in the Atlantic Canadian Climate Policy Network across the 4 provinces, 100 or 120 actors. And we tend to see government and international organizations are seen as the most influential, followed by political parties and NGOs, right? Then kind of behind that, kind of research institutes, universities, and environmental NGOs specifically. Now, within these subgroups, one thing that's interesting is that there's, one or a handful of very influential actors, and then it falls off very quickly. So influence seems to be very disproportionately concentrated amongst governmental actors, international organizations, and even within those sectors, within a very small number of actors that are seen as disproportionately influential. One thing here that's really interesting in comparison to some of the work we've done nationally in Canada is business sector actors don't come across as very influential. When people talk about who's having an influence on climate policy in Atlantic Canada. At the national level, I think we would see businesses being much more implicated in or constituent of the really influential policy network blocks. That seems to be less the case here, which I think is kind of interesting. But then if we move over to this middle graph, the second kind of relationship we're looking at is who is a source of scientific information? Who do you get your climate knowledge about? And we see that government and international organizations, and here we're thinking about the IPCC or UN bodies, are still seen as really important, really central to the network. But it flattens out a little bit with universities and research institutes becoming much more important, right? And actually that's probably good news. It does mean that people are at least reporting that they're getting information from us, from researchers, from research institutes, and from universities. Probably a good thing. I would say for a largely research and academic audience that I'm assuming we have here, one of the takeaways from this graph might be this is probably where our strength and power lies to intervene, right? We're probably not going to be very influential directly on climate policy, but we can find pathways in as sources of scientific information. And I think that's maybe just an interesting kind of side takeaway from this graph, is that that's where our kind of windows of opportunity lie in terms of trying to maybe have some impact on what's going on with climate governance in the region. Going over to the graph on the right, the third thing that we look at is relationships of collaboration and mutual support. And here what we see that's quite interesting is, whereas we have these very, kind of power law distribution, few actors that are extremely important, and then a rapid decline, this collaboration network is much flatter and much less hierarchical, which is interesting, I think also. So people are tending to collaborate with kind of more maybe broader networks of people. It's not all just concentrating on necessarily the same small group of actors that are seen as most influential or the most, kind of go-to sources of scientific information. So like the collaboration network is a bit more multifaceted, a bit flatter, a bit more non-hierarchical. So it's an interesting snapshot of the political infrastructure of climate governance when we kind of look at the policy networks that also is a bit different than the picture we get from who's showing up in media discourse, which is very concentrated amongst these government actors in particular, largely, like much more so than the other sectors. I would say that when we look at kind of who's most prevalent in media discourse. So to sum up some of those kind of big picture takeaways, if we think about the social cultural infrastructure of climate action, the kind of discursive part of it, we don't see a lot of visibility for explicit climate skepticism in regional media discourse of climate policy networks. And then Ches Crosby showed up this week in my newsfeed to try to prove me wrong, saying he went to Ottawa, testified to Senate that climate change is bogus. And I was like, oh crap, there goes the slide deck I just prepped for Friday. But then it actually kind of ended up proving the very point, because the PC party that he used to be the leader of, the conservative, party in Newfoundland and Labrador that he's a former leader of, very rapidly responded to distance themselves from those comments and to say, actually, that is not what our party believes at all. We distance themselves. So, I think we do see that distancing from climate skepticism, kind of does cross provinces and party lines to quite a large degree, where when somebody does step out and say, hey, climate change is bogus, the PC party says, nope, that's not us, right? That's our former leader being kind of wacky over in Ottawa. So there is that high consensus overall that climate change is occurring and does require response. And where we do see more consensus is around the green growth kind of responses, like renewable energy, scaling up renewable energies. So I think from a more practice and policy perspective, pushing on, like advancing that is probably a good thing. It's strategic, right? Like play into that. The green growth stuff is kind of a strategic way to make some headway, maybe. By contrast, the trickier things, the things that are more contentious, is the stuff around carbon tax, limiting oil exploration and extraction, all of that kind of stuff. And of course, where Ches Crosby was saying climate change is bogus was largely, as part of an argument that federal climate action was going to hurt our resource extraction sector here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So there we do see a bit of that. Okay, yes, those are the more contentious issues that maybe if we're thinking about advancing climate action, we need to think about how can we reframe support for those issues, or how can policymakers reframe support for those policy orientations in ways that are just kind of aware that they're contentious. What can you do to get more people on side to kind of deal with the reaction you're inevitably going to get if you're trying to advance a carbon tax or trying to limit oil exploration, right? We know those are going to be contentious issues. And the third thing there that's interesting is there's less consensus around the kind of more justice-oriented policy orientations, that like intergenerational justice or interregional justice on a more international scale. So I think one read of our data, I think I'm talking with Yishi and Laura, was climate action, yes, climate justice, maybe. Seems like a little less consensus on those kind of issues. When we look at the political infrastructures of climate action in Atlantic Canada, I think it's interesting that they are asymmetrical and they vary, the policy networks here, depending on whether we're looking at policy influence, scientific information, or collaboration relationships. So we might be thinking, hey, climate action will need to be advanced in different ways through these different networks, and maybe different actors have different avenues, right? So if you're a researcher, you have maybe more of a role to play in some of those avenues than others, right? For example, or if you're an environmental organization, things like that. So I think that gives us a bit of a more nuanced understanding of the structure of kind of political infrastructures of climate change and sustainability in Atlantic Canada. So I wanted to bring this in a less than 25 minutes, and I think it's 24 minutes now. So I think right on track. I think as a closer, I would just, kind of pitch that scaling this kind of compound project, this big multinational kind of project that's been on the go since 2007, scaling it to Atlantic Canada to a more regional scale through WP6, I would argue is giving us some really valuable insight into the social, cultural, and political infrastructures that can either facilitate or impede climate action and sustainability transitions in our region, in Atlantic Canada as well. So thank you very much for your attention. And let's just throw the floor open for discussion. And I would say we have the benefit of having both Tuomas and Karen in the room as well, who are both team members on this WP. So I'm hoping, to make this a bit of an impromptu panel and ask them to jump in to the discussion as well as people have questions and do it that way. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, so now I'd like to invite questions to Mark and hopefully Tuomas and Karen, comments or contributions to Mark's presentation. Okay, Paul, please.
That was great, Mark and team. Lots to discuss, and I'm really sorry, but I have to start off with Ches Crosby. Just a couple of things. One is I actually don't think he said climate change is bogus, even though, and I just Googled it again, a lot of the headlines are saying that that's the headline. I remember him watching media, and I could be wrong, but basically what he said was human-induced climate change is not real. So that he started off his speech by saying the climate changes all the time. So that's the other sort of heavy right-wing perspective on it, is that they admit climate change, but they just say it's normal, right? Anyway, that's beside the point. My question is related, I suppose, is how the really important kind of research you're doing, how could it capture those minority perspectives that are not the consensus, but that are disproportionately influencing some of the policy debates that we see, say nationally? Certainly in the US it's clear. It's probably not as significant here, but I think we'd be probably in dangerous territory if we completely overlooked it, right? So what could be some types of research to capture those more hidden, the supporters of Crosby, those who are out there saying, yes, that's Crosby, that's what I think too, right? Yeah.
So a few different answers to that. And yeah, I mean, I admit, yeah, I was working very much from the headline level of the Crosby story, but it also gets at it. So I'm gonna take a little bit of a side path before I answer the rest of the question, but there is this shifting face of climate denial, right? And I think what we're seeing is, and actually in the anti-environmentalism handbook, we write about this, that kind of old school denial 1.0 kind of is like climate change is not happening, kind of morphed into, well, it's solar rays, whatever, that kind of stuff. It's natural. It happens all the time. It's been happening for eons. But even that's kind of shifting more and more in recent years to, yes, it's happening. Yes, and actually the next, probably the third step along that of climate denial 1.0 is like the Bjorn Lomborg, right? Yes, it's happening. Yes, it's real, but there's more important issues to worry about. Why should we put money and resources into worry about, right? So those would be maybe like the classic kind of denial arguments. In recent years, though, I think we're seeing more and more what Bill Carroll has talked about as soft denial and others. We talk about as denial 2.0 in the anti-environmentalism handbook is saying, you know, climate change is real. We need to do something about it, but then using tactics to delay or obstruct, to say, well, basically, we can't bring in something that's going to impact the oil sands negatively too fast, right? For example, right? Or that's going to actually shut down the oil or, you know, impact in any way the oil exploration program in Newfoundland and Labrador. So those things, by keeping those things contentious, and we see like in the media discourse, the two big contentious things are oil exploration and carbon taxes. So that's where you have that terrain of kind of delay coming up. It's not classic climate denial, but it is kind of just working to slow down action, right? So you can admit that climate change is happening and then argue that maybe we don't take these policy measures that would actually need to be taken, right? Another thing we see in some of the national level work that we've done over the years on the kind of the Canadian scale is that for the most part, let's just take the oil sector because that's a big one in Canada, right? The oil sector themselves are not necessarily seen as the most influential in the room always, or the most visible in media, but they're very well connected to policy network blocks that cross both parties. So they're just very well connected. They have a lot of social capital, and it's often actually politicians, so government or political parties, and think tanks that give voice to the interests of the oil sector more than it is oil sector actors standing up and speaking in their own defense. So you're way less likely to see Suncor in the news saying, hey, we need to protect the oil sands. We can't do anything that's going to slow down development in the oil sands. You're much more likely to see a conservative politician or the Fraser Institute or somebody like that giving voice to those kinds of arguments, right? So it kind of, I mean, one way I haven't put this in writing anywhere yet, but like I like this thing like sock puppet theory of corporate power, where like the oil sector interests, they're not out there voicing them themselves necessarily. They're doing it much more subtle ways through their network capital in policy networks and stuff like that, which we have mapped out much more at that kind of national level. Yeah. I don't know if I see Barb has a hand, but maybe Tomas or Karen, if you want to jump in on any of Paul's questions as well.
Well, I guess I could just quickly confirm what you're saying, and that we're seeing the same thing going on everywhere else in the world that we study. So, we moved beyond whether it's real or not. There's not that much talk about that anymore, at least in the mainstream media or when we survey the central actors. But one thing there is that somewhere in the depths of social media, you do find that kind of stuff still. So that's one thing that we can observe, even in places like Finland, where skeptic arguments have never really made it very far. But you dig into a little bit of Twitter and retweet networks and these kind of things, you can find that stuff. It's much more contentious there. So that's one thing to add. Another thing, this green growth consensus obviously has kind of grown really. We did a study of this from about 1997 so from the Kyoto Protocol year to about 2017, I think, a comparative of several different countries. And you can really see that the green growth thing is picking up. And so we went from, is it real or not? That's kind of gone, is it too expensive to fight climate change. That doesn't get so much traction. But really these delay arguments that Mark was talking about, and these justice issues, and they're everywhere. They're a bit different in different countries. So in Finland we don't have oil, so they talk about logging. So we have big carbon sinks and we have a big forest industry that is cutting those trees. There's still a bit of burning of peat for energy, which it's disappearing now, but it used to be a big contentious issue. So the issues are a bit different in different countries, but we're kind of at this same level of these delay discourses and these justice issues of what about the forest owners, and what about our country versus the other countries, right? That's what the populist politicians are saying in Finland. It's like they say, well, the US should move and China should move, and we've already done so much, and we're so little. It's such a little country that even if we stop driving all the cars in Finland, it's not going to make a difference. So these kind of things are where we're at now.
Of course, another common delay discourse in Canada is that we don't have that big a carbon footprint in global comparisons, which usually ignores the fact that per capita we're one of the 3 or 4 worst in the country on a per capita basis, up there with Australia and the US. But yeah, so.
Barb, would you like to ask a question or make a comment?
Sure. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
And Tuomas for adding the international layer. Really interesting. So just a few thoughts, I guess. The invisibility of municipalities. Your focus is Atlantic Canada. Do you think this has to do in part with the weakness of municipalities in terms of the governance structure in Atlantic Canada? Secondly, I'm interested in rural-urban divides because lots of Atlantic Canada is rural. And I'm certainly seeing rural-urban divides around some of these issues, and of course, carbon tax and certain kinds of things. I mean, we hear about low income, high income, but farmers and people who live in rural areas and so on. There's a rural-urban issue here, and did you have any sense of that? I guess so. Those are my questions or thoughts.
Yeah, so in terms of the data here, I'm a bit surprised. I think if you look at the Delphi part of our analysis, I think people talk about municipalities as being important. If memory serves, point to municipalities as being, actors that should be more involved. And again, it's a high consensus idea. Everybody agrees with it. Nobody's disagreeing that they shouldn't be. But yeah, it might be the weakness of the municipalities within Atlantic Canada just means that specific, they're not showing up necessarily as nominated like influential actors, or they're not showing up a ton in the media. I'm kind of a bit surprised, Halifax being a bit bigger, that they wouldn't be showing up a bit more. Certainly when we look at national media, the city of Vancouver, city of Montreal, city of Toronto, they all do show up and actually do make it into national media with a decent amount of visibility. Maybe not as much as the provincial governments of Quebec or BC or Ontario, but they're still captured in that media discourse network in a way that we don't really see replicated here. Despite everybody saying, hey, municipalities are important. On the rural urban, I don't think we have much in task 3 or 4 data, but Karen, I know you've done other work in this area, so that might be a really excellent question for you to take.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the survey that we did for FOCI, there was no real rural urban comparison, even though we did have Atlantic Canada wide data. But in most of the research we've done, there aren't huge rural urban differences, and they don't tend to fall along the kind of stereotypical divide that you might expect, where rural people are more conservative or what have you in Atlantic Canada anyway. But and I'm trying to think if I've actually done any work looking specifically at climate change discourse in rural Atlantic Canada, and I haven't. But I do know, just in a general way, that there are the same sort of ideas you know, that we might all kind of expect, like that farmers feel like the, you know, the expectations are unfair for them, and that the pressure to comply specifically with environmental regulations is like a really big burden, and they don't have the resources to do it. And I think that's mostly what it boils down to, is just this feeling that there is not a consideration of rural realities in environmental policy and regulations, and even just the discourses that kind of like pressure us to behave one way or the other. Like rural people have to drive further for services, and that's not because they love driving, it's because the services have left their communities. I think that's what's going on. The same thing with the carbon tax, the same thing with you know, just the pile of regulations on food producers from the Department of Environment around irrigation and that kind of thing. The regulations just get more burdensome every year, and even if farmers are, you know, some of the people who are closest to the effects of climate change, and you know, they see them and they believe in it and they know it's a problem, they still feel like the least resource to actually do anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, like, on the the carbon tax being contentious, like we used a fairly structured approach to coding our media data. So it would be really interesting to pull those. I think it was maybe 3 or 4 dozen articles that talk about climate tax where it would be contentious, and kind of recode them for whether how much that is rural urban divides, and whether that's part of what's fueling that contention over the carbon tax versus how much it's a more just kind of broad brush reaction, you know, kind of conservative reaction to Trudeau, kind of, you know, that kind of thing. You know, like, and a bit more of a nuanced analysis of that contention would be quite interesting along those lines. Yeah.
Just a couple of other questions. So are you going to say something, John?
No, I was just going to say that there's kind of two things to this rural-urban divide. From my perspective, one is that, you know, the things that Karen was mentioning, you know, you have to drive further, and especially in Finland, the logging thing, obviously, is a lot of the landowners or forest owners are rural people. So really, you know, some of these climate change policies that are being implemented or proposed do hit the countryside harder. At the same time, the people who air these discourses, these delay discourses, tend to be the populist politicians, and they get voted a lot in the countryside, even though and they might not be talking about countryside when they talk about climate change. They may be talking about, you know, these things like, should Finland move, or should the US and China move, or these kind of things. They don't necessarily say, you know, we are, you know, holding up for the countryside, but so they kind of get this general conservative vote, even though, you know, even from people who, you know, who don't think about the countryside specifically, but they happen to get their vote from there. So it's symbolically coming. Sort of, there's a symbolic urban rural divide as well.
I was also going to say, did you reflect on the media structure in Atlantic Canada versus other parts of Canada? I mean, somebody said recently that Saltwire is the most liberal or the most radical. I don't know how newspaper outlet in Canada, but the media is, first of all, is not static. And secondly, I think there may be heavier reliance on particular media sources in Atlantic Canada than there is elsewhere. And secondly, in your governance analysis, do you have public relations firms? Because they do, I mean, all of the greenwashing shifting that you're describing, of course, is not unique to climate change. We've seen it with asbestos, we've seen it with many things, and they're often hiring the same public relations firms. So are they actors that you've identified?
Yeah, so I think, so to take, I guess, the first question first. So we haven't, so I mean, as somebody who's done media stuff for ages, I'm always, I guess, conscious of it, but it hasn't made it into like it's not really accounted for in the analysis per se, or the article. So the media data we were working with was 2015 to 2020, during which time, you know, the different papers we were looking at. So it was the Telegram, the Chronicle Herald, the Charlottetown Guardian, and the St. John paper. That's the biggest one in New Brunswick that I'm blanking on the name of right now. But they've kind of, their ownership kind of, shifted around during that period. Saltwire took over more and more during that period. So as you get, further into the period for the media coverage, you're even just going to find more repetition across the 4 papers as well. Less diversity of voices, all that kind of stuff. But I think we do, I think one thing I didn't get into much today, but I think the visibility of kind of academics and researchers is maybe a bit higher than we would see in Canada in general, because we've done national level analysis of kind of media going back to 2010 and even earlier. Actually, I think 2006 kind of been tracking this stuff on a national level. So I think you see maybe some more research voices, that kind of stuff. But you always see like particular environmental groups get in, I think, as part of the debate. But I think the thing we see that, pretty consistently though, nationally or Atlantic Canada, is not a lot of business interests speaking for themselves, right? And it's always that, and this is one of the big things that I think Tuomas and I and Dave Tyndall, who I work with, have been writing about quite a bit now over the years, is people often assume a kind of symmetry between policy networks and who's influential in policy networks and media visibility and who's visible in media coverage of policy debate. And that's not necessarily true. I think the symmetries are very partial. Environmental groups and researchers tend to be much more visible in media discourse than they are influential in policy networks. By contrast, business actors are often much less visible in media discourse and more influential in policy networks. So I think it's a real mistake to just assume that media discourse is going to be a mirror of what's going on in policy networks. And it's more of I think they should be treated as kind of a research question. How does it look in particular areas? And it's like, yes, media visibility might help pro-environmental voices gain some influence, but it doesn't necessarily offset the kind of social capital that businesses avail of through policy networks that maybe mean they don't have to be, in the media all the time trying to defend their own interests, that it's better for them to sit back and let politicians do it, or think tanks, who often show up to as well to kind of give voice to kind of business interests. We haven't really included public relations firms, and I think that's mostly because they tend to be pretty behind the scenes. They would take, so the ways we've tended to build up our samples, and maybe that's a thing that we should actually bring to a compound discussion at some point, actually, because I don't think anybody in compound has really done much with public relations firms, because the way we tend to build our samples haven't really been able to get at these kind of behind the scenes actors. So we do get certainly think tanks, both conservative and more liberal, and a lot of the conservative think tanks do that work as well, of kind of voicing kind of delay tactics, or voicing, the interests of kind of corporate sectors and things like that. But I don't know. Yeah, if Karen or Tuomas, you have anything you want to add to that PR company point, which is an interesting one.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that point, that I raised my hand just before you got into this very last point, and I was going to say more or less the same thing, that I really appreciate the question, and I think it's really important, but it's also really difficult to get at, because you look at the media data and it won't show there who did it, but also if you do the surveys, like these measures of influence that we use, they're pretty good actually. They're well tested across different policy fields. And it is kind of intuitive also, because you go to the 100 most important organizations in this field and you ask them who's important. They know, right? You get, it's a very good proxy of actual influence, but they won't mention the PR firms, because they, no one, they don't. Everyone uses a different PR firm, and they don't come out as PR firms, so they don't. None of the measures we use in these things actually capture that, and we should think about it more. And I think it's more a matter of kind of qualitative work and kind of investigative journalism. Sociology, why not political science? But yeah, a different kind of thing.
And there has been some more work in the United States around lobbying, where which is a bit easier to track than in Canada, I suspect, or maybe, but I know, because I know Dana Fisher and others have written about that, if you look at districts that have had more lobbying from the coal and the oil sectors, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, you're more likely to kind of vote kind of against climate action and pro-industry, right? That there are some very clear effects when you look at, you know, kind of fossil fuel sector lobbying and how people vote, regardless of political party affiliation. But I mean, we've looked at policy networks here, and we do see both liberal and conservative politicians are pretty well networked to fossil fuel sector folks, but we don't really have the same data on, you know, kind of how much money that is being thrown at folks, or, you know, what kind of PR, you know, kind of activities going on, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Tuomas. Paul?
Just wondering, as the discussion goes on, you know, about actors and networks, it's thinking through the sort of more than human theoretical, you know, advances and perspectives, and what you might think about that. You know, I would assume that some of the risks perhaps will be capturing, you know, extreme weather events, right? Or those dangers and hazards. But, you know, thinking about some of the data set going to 2020 and Atlantic Canada experiencing some significant events, Fiona and others, other events, and, you know, snowfall, rainfall, so strange weather, probably even impacting perceptions even more as we go on. And I think that's fairly well understood that, you know, one of the biggest influence on people's perceptions might be, you know, climate change events themselves, right? Whether locally or even just seen from afar. So just wondering, and I know that might not be captured in the data, but just your reflections on that, sort of the potential impact of, you know, climate change on perceptions itself, right?
I'm going to kick that over to Karen, because I think you probably have a better handle on the perceptions, like the public survey.
I mean, all I can say is that I think you're right. It's a good idea to update this stuff based on how much has happened since yeah, the survey was 2021. No, the report was 2021, so the survey was 2020. Yeah, although I don't know if it necessarily would have you know, had that much of an effect on the types of things that we found are still in flux, like the, you know, the agreement that climate change is real and it's happening and something needs to be done is probably very much the same. Yeah, I don't think people are as rational as to, you know, suddenly decide that all the barriers to doing something about climate change have disappeared just because we've had more events. It would be interesting anyway to do a comparison. Not that I'm volunteering to do that, but
And I think it would be interesting to kind of rerun it. You know, perhaps after the next federal election, say Poilievre comes in on like a very populist discourse that's probably going to be much more anti-environmental, whether that does start, you know, because I think the consensus around climate change is happening, it presents risks in Atlantic Canada, is a bit different than what we see in other parts of Canada so far, right? Maybe Quebec might be similar here, where even if you're more conservative, you still tend to kind of be pro climate action. But I think if I can just imagine, though, if Poilievre does take the next election, that you might see that polarization kind of trickle out more to regions like ours, where so far have been a bit resilient to that kind of polarization. But
yeah.
just a guess.
Yeah, it could be. And I also think we learned, like in doing some analysis and in trying to push beyond just the, you know, the original report into some more like theoretical stuff. I think there are going to be better ways to ask the questions, you know, next time, that get at some of the, I guess, the ways that people's perceptions of climate change might be embedded in their perceptions of other things, if that makes sense. Like Barb's question about the municipalities made me think about it because, you know, Halifax, I think, does a lot around climate change, but it's embedded in other files. So there's a lot on food policy, and all of it, you know, takes as a given that climate change is occurring and that, you know, climate is both one of the reasons why we need to care more about food and also, you know, affecting our ability to access healthy food and all that kind of stuff. So I wonder if there's maybe more nuanced ways of getting at where climate where climate discourses are, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
And I think in terms of actually also circling back to Barb's earlier question, I think Emily Huddart Kennedy at UBC has done a lot of work on environmental values stuff, survey type stuff that's more sensitive to urban-rural differences and tries to construct questions with less of an urban bias, which she argues that most of our environmental surveys tend to build in. So I think, you know, like borrowing from some of the work she's done as well for kind of tracking this going forward, you know, can also be very useful. Yeah.
Yeah, like even just one thing that comes up in my research is like the errand batching that people do, where they're, you know, they can't take public transportation, but they think about climate when they're deciding not to like nip out to, you know, Costco and Walmart and all of these things in the city, you know, on different days. They do it all in one day in one trip. So yeah, the pro-environmental behaviors I think are different. And also our student there, Matthew, who looked into perceptions of climate change and really tried to get at like you know, more rural understandings of what outdoor leisure might look like. Like it could be riding an ATV, and that's okay. You know. Anyway, lots to dig into there.
Yeah, so someone who has some pretty interesting answers to this question is Mike Schaefer. He's German, based in Switzerland somewhere, and they did this big project where they collected media data from around the world, like not nuanced at all, just like how many times climate change was mentioned in, you know, dozens and dozens of countries. And they worked with climate scientists, and they took the world map and they kind of divided it into squares, and they looked at how much the temperature on a given year had deviated from normal in each square, and then they mapped that onto countries, and then they looked at the correlations of whether, you know, whether there is whether where the weather is more deviant from normal, whether there is more coverage of climate change, and they were kind of in the middle of this project when I talked to him, and at that point at least they had not seen much of a correlation at that level. But that was some years ago, so you know, you could look up some of his stuff and see if they found something. But this is of course like a very aggregate level, and it doesn't focus on extreme weather. It focuses on deviations from normal. But I don't think they found much there actually.
Thank you, Tuomas. Okay, well, we've come to the end of our hour for this.
Oh, Sharon, I'm sorry. I see there's a comment in the chat. Is there that looked like maybe it was from Seiko? I want to close with
Okay,
that,
yes.
or see if there's anything we want to.
Absolutely. Okay, what about
30 seconds.
pro-environment? I'm sorry, I'll just read it out loud. What about pro-environment business organizations or entities? How influential are they in the media or policy? European companies are obliged to adopt several climate actions, and they don't want it to do it alone.
So to say, in the Atlantic Canadian media and policy network data that we have, business actors in general are not very visible, whether they're pro or anti-environmental. So we don't, you know, we're not seeing a lot of presence of kind of Equinor or of, you know, wind energy companies, for example. Like, so there is a lot of consensus though around green growth, and the kind of renewable kind of transitions are going to be a positive thing. So that discourse is certainly there, of a pro-environmental business case, a business case for pro-environmental change. But we're not necessarily seeing specific pro-environment business organizations come up a lot in the data. And I think in the same, on the national scale in Canada, the business actors we tend to be more extractive industries, even though you still might get those business case for climate action more often being invoked by, say, the Liberal Party. A lot of the provincial governments that are kind of more climate leaders, like Quebec or BC, will often give those arguments, and they're the ones making those arguments more than specific business actors. Yeah. But yeah, Tuomas, you might have a good sense of, from a more kind of higher level compound perspective.
Well, very quickly, since Europe is mentioned here, I'm gonna say a few words about the European country I know best, Finland, and here this is big. So here the biggest, or the biggest businesses, kind of the biggest business interest organizations made a huge turn some years ago, and they were, they used to be, they used to resist ambitious climate change measures, but when the Paris Agreement really started sinking in, and the fact that Europe is gonna force them to do stuff, they turned, and once they turned, the political parties started turning, the pro-business party started turning, the Social Democratic Party started turning. So yeah, there are places where what you're describing is a big thing, but not everywhere.
Yeah, and actually, I was just coming back recently from Norway, from Tromsø. A couple of Equinor execs were there, and I think partly when they embraced the discourse, at least, of being a leader in the green transition about 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, I think that gave quite a push similarly to the Norwegian government to maybe change some things up and kind of redirect things. But then, of course, you have some quite critical people who are quite skeptical or critical about the depth of commitment of Equinor to the green transition, and Norway being a leader and all that stuff. But that's a conversation over a couple of beers and another time. So.
Hey, awesome. So I've got everyone. Excellent. Okay, thank you so much, Mark, for presenting, and Tuomas and Karen, thank you for your comments and your contributions. I'm just going to close us off with, we would like to thank everyone for their participation in this webinar. We encourage further dialogue, potentially over a couple of beers, as Mark said, to see that this conversation continues. Future Ocean and Coastal Infrastructures is generously supported by the Ocean Frontier Institute, the Canada First Research Excellence Fund, and the Department of Industry, Energy, and Technology of the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. We would also like to give thanks to the dozens of partners and funders that have also supported our 13 FOCI research work packages, which are making important contributions to addressing the challenges of sustainability, safety, and inclusion in ocean and coastal industries and communities in Atlantic Canada. We do have another webinar coming up. We're not sure if it'll be next month or the following month, but please keep your eyes open for that. And thank you again.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.